Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome to another tank review. This time we are taking a look at the Tier 5 American Premium Heavy Tank, the T14. This is a bit of an odd one, if I'm honest. So, the T14 was essentially a way for the United States Ordnance Department to try and flog the Brits a new tank during the Second World War. Now, the British had experience of the early versions of the Churchill tank at the Dieppe raids, and, well, it wasn't a particularly glowing initial performance. So there was definitely some interest in something that could fulfill a similar role to the Churchill, but do it better. And there were sort of two designs that were worked on. One is the Excelsior, which we also have in the game, which was a British design, and the other was this, the T14. So the essential idea was that the tank in question, that the Americans were looking at, would share a lot of parts with the M4 Sherman, i.e. essentially it was based off the M4 Sherman with some modifications, and would use either a British 6-pounder gun or the American 75mm gun. And this would have been an improvement in firepower over the early versions of the Churchill, because early versions of the Churchill, along with so many other British tanks during the Second World War, used the 2-pounder gun, which was a good gun for its time, but by the time you're in sort of the 1940s, the 2-pounder gun, which is a 40mm gun for anyone who needs the conversion, is looking a little long in the tooth. So, although this thing would share a lot of components and whatnot with the M4 Sherman, it was actually fairly heavily modified. So the armour at the front was sloped at a more extreme angle to give it greater effective thickness, and actually the effective frontal armour thickness on the hull here was over 100mm straight on, which is kind of comparable with the Tiger tank. Just to give you a sense of perspective, people don't really appreciate how heavily armoured the Sherman was for its time. The frontal glacis on just the raw Sherman could get up to about 80-85mm thick with that sloping. T14 sloped back further, and you're up to, like I say, about 100mm there. So, initially the British ordered best part of 10,000 of these things. And that was in 1942, and then some, detailed design work started, culminating in a pilot vehicle. And that was found to be too heavy for practical use. This was not a light tank. The Sherman wasn't a light tank, let's be honest. And by the time you've slapped some more armour on and whatnot, you've made the thing heavier. And also, this is 1944. At this point, the Brits have been using the Churchill for a couple of years, and they're kind of satisfied with the Churchill, and it's been upgraded, it's been updated, so now the Churchill is using a 6-pounder gun, so it's got a punchier gun, which is one of the gun options for this tank. And so they're kind of like, well, what's the point now? So it never saw production, and one of these things, or the example that was sent to the UK, lives in Bovington, which won't come as a great surprise to anyone, I imagine. And there was something to come of this. Some of the work on this was used in the T20. Essentially, the Americans were interested in a similarly armoured machine to this, but a bit faster. And like I say, that would be used as the basis for the T20 medium tank, which also would never see production. So there we go. This was the American attempt to give the Brits an infantry support tank that just came a little bit too late for it to really be on the nose, if we're going to be honest. It is what it is. So, let's just compare the stats of this thing to a couple of other American tanks. Let's remember this is an American tank. A couple of other American tanks in the game that I think are kind of comparable. And I'm going to highlight one thing now that I think I'm actually going to potentially forget when looking at the stats. I can't quite remember. This thing gets 900 hit points. Now, all the Tier 5s have had their hit points wiggled since, I took my break from the game, and 900 sounds like a lot at Tier 5, and it is. So I just want to highlight that. As you're looking through all the other stats, please remember this thing packs 900 hit points, which is quite a lot. Anyway, let's have a look at some stats. So let's do a little bit of stats comparison. So we've got the T14, and I'm comparing this with the M4A1 Sherman with the stock gun, and with the T1 Heavy fully upgraded. So the T1 Heavy is pretty obvious. They're both supposed to be Tier 5 heavy tanks, even though the T14 gets limited matchmaking, premium matchmaking. The M4A1, I'm doing this to compare it with a same tier tank using the same gun. I appreciate the Sherman is not a heavy tank, so it's not going to be identical, but I just wanted to get that comparison in. So, what do we get? Well, straight away, the DPM on the T14 is the worst in this comparison, only just. The M4A1 is got an extra few DPM over the T14. The T1 Heavy has a rather significant amount more. And if we have a look, it's not difficult to see why. Whilst the rate of fires are all pretty similar here, the T1 Heavy does get a better rate of fire, and the M4A1 does get a better rate of fire than the T14, but the T1 Heavy is also packing that higher alpha damage. 110 alpha damage for both the T14 and the M4. Again, the M4 is with the stock gun, and 115 with the T1 Heavy. T1 gets 128 penetration, and the other two, of course, get 92. Which is not very good. Module damage, 100 for both of the 75mm guns on the T14 and M4, and 105 for the 76mm gun on the T1 Heavy. If we have a look at shell velocity, again, it's poor shell velocity for the two 75mm gun machines at 619. Ammo capacity is quite a lot for both of the 75mm gun armed tanks. 110 ammo on the T14 is generally sufficient. It's more than the T1 Heavy, and that means you do have a higher potential damage, but do bear in mind you will miss/bounce more for reasons that we'll come on to in a moment. In terms of gun handling, aim time, the T14 is the best in this comparison, though there's not that much in it. The T1 Heavy still has a respectable aim time of 2.21 and the M4 2.01. Dispersion, atrocious, 0.44 on the T14, 0.44 on the Sherman, 0.41 on the T1 Heavy. Bloom values are identical across the board in every instance. Gun elevation on the T1 Heavy is better than the other two. I mean, whoop-de-doop. They're still decent enough. And the Sherman gets 12 degrees of gun depression compared to 10 degrees on the other two, but 10 is still pretty good. Now, speed. The Sherman, in this comparison, you would expect to do the best because it's the medium tank, and it does. But you might be thinking the T14 comes somewhere in between the other two, as it's basically a beefed-up Sherman, so you might expect it to be kind of similar. And, well, yes, and then again, no. So the T14 has a forward speed limit of 34 kilometers an hour, which is not very good. The T1 Heavy is not renowned for being speedy, and it has 35, and the Sherman has 48. 10 km an hour reverse speed is kind of more appropriate for a Tier 5 heavy tank. 720 horsepower engine though, much better than the Sherman, which gives this thing, when you consider that it weighs just shy of 48 tons, a power to weight ratio of 15.07, which is the worst in this comparison. Which might surprise some people, because again, you'd think perhaps the T14 is going to be more mobile than that, but no. However, it's not all bad news. Whilst the Sherman does beat it in terms of mobility, on the T14 you do at least get better ground resistances than the T1 Heavy, so there is that. In terms of traverse values, the turret traverse is pretty poor on the T14. The tank traverse, base tank traverse, is pretty poor on the T14, certainly compared to the other two. And on hard, medium, soft terrain, it doesn't get any better. So, actually, bizarre as it might seem, the T14 is no faster than either of the other two tanks in this comparison, and it's kinda slower, which is weird. Anyway, armour. We're going to look at the armour in more detail in just a moment. Essentially, you have a stock Sherman turret, so 50.8mm of armour on the front. You do get better sides and rear armour, though, on the turret compared to the Sherman, and the T1 Heavy just gets a better turret. Sorry, I said turret. On the hull, my apologies, the T14 has 50.8 on the front, same as the Sherman, and then sides, rear are better on the T14, and the hull on the T1 Heavy is better. On the turret, the T14 is much more like the T1 Heavy at 101mm, and actually it gets that all round on the turret. So this is arguably the best turret in this comparison. 900 hit points also beats either of the others, including the T1 Heavy, and that's a pretty chonky boy in this comparison, which is quite nice. And, well, you have better module health, but that's kind of a pretty insignificant point. Camouflage, it's not the biggest tank in the world, so camouflage ratings are kind of between the two here. Not as good as the Sherman, but better than the T1 Heavy. Base view range at 330 is rubbish, but the same as the T1 Heavy. Radio range at basically 600 meters. I have occasionally found that people fall outside of radio range there. Shell cost, who cares, it's cheap and cheerful. And the far more impactful thing when we're talking about shell cost will be how much APCR you fire. So essentially, what we have is a tank with, and I cannot emphasise this enough, a bad gun. The M3 75mm gun sucks, especially on a heavy tank. And unfortunately, it's not like you really have the mobility to compensate. Don't get me wrong, you can certainly go and shoot up some medium tanks, but you're not a medium tank, and if you try and play it like one, you're going to quickly notice that you're not fast enough. What this means is that you're going to be shooting some APCR. That's just something you're going to have to live with. If that's a problem for you, you do not want this tank. I have seen people play this and similar vehicles with very low penetration at tier 5. In fact, I've seen people play the T14, and you can tell when they're refusing to fire APCR because they opt into a fight against a tank with thick armour. They then have nothing to do except throw harsh language at it, and apparently these same people doesn't cross their minds to try and track the guy and get around their sides, and they do nothing, and they're a waste of space on their team. So, if you're going to play the T14, don't be afraid to fire a little bit of APCR. Anyway, I'm going to have a look at the armour of this thing. So how does that armour actually stack up in practice? Well, rear of the hull is still 50.8mm thick. The reason I'm highlighting that is that this is not a tank that you can get around the sides and the rear of and just throw HE at and it will be fine. The typical penetration on 75mm HE, which is fairly common at tier 5, is about 38. So you're not going through the rear of this tank realistically with that. If you have shots down onto the engine deck, then it's still a bit of a dicey shot. It depends where you're going to shoot. This sort of angled strip of armour is 38.1mm thick before any angling, so you don't want to shoot it there. If you're going to fire HE, you want to shoot it here where it's 19mm thick, maybe the turret roof where it's 25. But this thing actually stands up pretty well to high explosive. Better than you would expect. On the side, so it's 50.8mm thick, but you've got these nice side skirts, so actually the side armour on this thing is better than people expect. So you can angle this thing, you know, around about that, and you're still looking at 130 odd millimeters of armour. It's not a trivial penetration. Add even more over the spaced sections along the sides. On the front of the hull, 50.8mm thick, like that is everywhere. With the angling, I mean, you're at 85-ish millimeters of effective armour. Unless you're using your gun depression, it doesn't really get any better than that. And you're old school. You still have a machine gun port as a weak point. Now, the armour might actually have a better raw thickness at 63.5, but it is flat as a pancake. So if you don't want to shoot APCR at a T14 and you're gonna, but you do have a lower penetration gun and you think the front of the hull might be a problem, say for example you're in a tier 4, shoot it in the machine gun port and that will do you fine. Lower front plate is actually 101mm thick, and include the angling, it's thicker than the rest of the hull, so you want to shoot this thing in the upper hull. Turret wise, well, it's pretty good actually. The sides and rear of the turret are no weaker. And the front is, well, you're looking at around 120-ish millimeters of effective armour outside of the gun mantlet. going up to about 130, 140. Across the gun mantlet, there's a hole where the gun is, sure, but you can get like 200 here. The turret's not bad. It's not invulnerable, but it's certainly not bad. Now, if you're going to be using your gun depression, all 10 degrees of it, your turret looks very similar, but the front of your hull goes up to a little over 100mm thick. Basically, this is a Sherman. And they're not renowned as being the toughest targets in the world. It's really the spaced armour along the sides and the turret armour that is going to be bouncing shots for you there. So, this is a premium tank, so there is of course absolutely no need to worry about the grind, because there isn't one. So what about crew skills? Well, it's a premium tank, so just whack in whatever American heavy tank crew you want. Now, this thing does get a commander, gunner, driver, radio operator, and loader. If we have a quick look at the tech tree, and we have a look at the American medium tanks, you're going to notice this is actually slightly awkward. So the T1 Heavy, for example, packs 6 crew members. It gets 2 gunners. So you can't train the full T1 Heavy crew. It's a similar story with the M6. That's basically the same tank. So one of the gunners is not going to get trained there, which is a little bit sad. The T29 has 2 loaders. Still a 6-person crew. The T32 has 2 loaders. You can see a pattern forming here, can't you? The M103 at tier 9. Finally, you have a 5-person crew. But this thing doesn't have an explicit radio operator. It has 2 loaders instead. So it's still not a good match for the M103. What about the T110E5? Maybe we can have something that properly fits. No, it has a 4-person crew. That's the annoying and awkward thing about the T14. If you want to use it as a crew trainer, the crew layout is actually really awkward because it doesn't exactly match any other American heavy tank. Just bear that in mind. Now, you can obviously combine crews, but just have that thought at the back of your mind when you're thinking about whether you would want to try and get your hands on this thing if there is the opportunity. So there's that. But we're not going to talk about crew skills because just whack a crew in that you've already got for it into the tank. So what about equipment and whatnot? Well, there are a few different options here, remembering that as we're at tier 5, you do not get a special equipment slot, so you're not going to get a bonus to any of these. My recommendations, well, what have we got here? Like, we're not going to use any of the sort of sneaky equipment, like, why would we bother, really? Well, we'll get to view range in a second, I suppose. Vents is always a reasonable option. Improve rotation mechanism, try and get those bloom values down a little bit, not a bad idea, and also would increase your traverse speed. And this thing does not have a great traverse speed, so I think that's actually a pretty strong option. Gun laying drive, well, the actual aim time itself is already pretty respectable, so whilst you could go for that, I think there are better options. Improved aiming, that would make the aiming circle just smaller across the board. Not necessarily a terrible choice, but wouldn't be at the top of my list of suggestions. Gun rammer is a gun rammer. It's good. You can see here that I'm using, for the record, a gun rammer and an improved rotation mechanism. Improved hardening. Well, you could. This thing does get a respectable slug of hit points at 900, but that's not the highest at tier 5. And you're not going to get the improved performance from it because, well, this doesn't have a specialised equipment slot. So you're going to get an extra 8% of your hit points. Is that worth it? That's a good question. I mean, that's what? An extra 72 hit points. So that's one more hit from like a 50cm gun. 50cm gun? Sorry, 5cm gun. Ooh. Or 50mm gun. I'm not convinced that's worth it, and you're probably not going to get it for any of the other bonuses. Though you might get it for fully restoring hit points after repairs, I suppose, but I can't really recommend it too much. You could try and get a turbocharger to make the tank a little bit faster. While this thing isn't the fastest thing in the world, I'm not really sure it's fully worth it. Spore liner, just don't bother. Improved configuration, improved repair speed, I guess. Guess you could, but again, I just don't think it's really all that worth it. I end up coming back to rammer. So my suggestion would be some assortment of gun rammer, improved rotation mechanism, enhanced gun laying drive, improved aiming, vents, and binos. The reason I say binos is that there are situations where you do actually want to get some view range out of a tank, even if it doesn't have great view range to start with. And your base view range is atrocious at 330 meters or something. So an extra 10% on top of that isn't going to do a huge amount of much. An extra 25% when stationary granted will take you up to 429 meters. So I've got binos for those situations where I need to do a little bit of spotting. And then I've got improved rotation mechanism to help with the traverse speed and the gun bloom, and a gun rammer for the extra DPM. But you might want to use, like I say, vents, or a gun lane drive, or improved aiming module, I suppose, over one of those, though I think of those, the vents would be my preferred one. I don't really like the improved aiming module, but hey-ho. And maybe some of you might want to use a turbocharger, but I'll leave that up to you. Consumables? Well, there's nothing fancy here. I've just got your standard ones. American tanks with their big fat American booties do tend to catch fire if people get you in the rear, so I'm not sure I would be willing to drop the fire extinguisher. And, you know, the other two, first aid kit, repair kit, I don't think I'd want to drop them either. So I would recommend those consumables. Ammo, you can see I've got a respectable amount of APCR here because the penetration on this gun sucks. Still more AP, and 15 high explosive. I mean, it's not as if the HE performance on this gun is anything special. It's more that HE performance on 75mm guns at tier 5 is fairly respectable, so situationally you can definitely make that work. And, oh, I'm not even going to talk about directives, because if you're in the business of looking at directives, you're probably not interested in this review, so let's not worry about that. And I think that's about all we really need to talk about, if we're being honest. So, let's go and have a look at some gameplay. So, replay time then. I'm going to do things a little bit differently this time. I usually show one top tier game, one bottom tier game, to try and give you an idea what the tank performs like in an advantageous situation and a disadvantageous situation, but in this particular instance, I'm not going to. This tank, as I mentioned, gets preferential matchmaking anyway, so you're never going to see tier 7s, and I'm not really sure what you would learn from watching a tier 6 game, specifically, other than against higher tier targets you become more reliant on firing gold, but I've banged on about how dubious this gun is anyway, so I don't really think there's much to gain from that. So instead, what I'm going to show you is one game where things aren't going to go amazingly well and we're going to have to try and dig ourselves out of trouble, so the tank is under pressure, and me as a player obviously. And then I'm going to try and show you one game where the tank is more allowed to control the engagement itself. That was a rubbish shot, just for the record. So this is the first match. This is a tier 5 game. We're here on the Glacier map, and it's tier 5s and tier 4s. So 5-10 matchmaking, roughly. There's actually 6 tier 5s rather than 5, so it's actually 6-9 matchmaking, but whatever, close enough. And what I'd like to do in heavy tanks is try and come to the central location on the map, because the thing with Glacier is it's basically split up into 3 sections. Down in the southeast corner on sort of the sort of J9 area, you've got this kind of corridor going on, which you can go to, but the problem is if you do, you're sort of isolated from the rest of the map. You've then got the heavy corridor in the northwest, but again, it's kind of isolated, and even if you do win it and push through, then what? You tend to find you get shot in the face by campers. So I go to the central location, assuming, of course, that I'm not in such a slow ponderous tank that it's just never going to work. Anyway, so we spot out a couple of dudes, and I'm about to make a misjudgment. So I'm aware the T1 Heavy and the KV-220 are pushing around the heavy tank area. But I was expecting, we take a penetration there from a Panzer IV-H. I was expecting, just before we get onto that, where did that guy penetrate? Difficult to see, actually. Either way, he has 110 average penetration, he does not need gold to pen me. But I was expecting them to take a little bit longer about it, so I engaged this Panzer IV-H, and, well, you can see I'm now getting shot in the side by a T1 Heavy, and this thing turns slowly. Oh dear. It's quite frustrating. And it quickly becomes apparent that I can't fight this guy like this. So that's 3 shots into me, 4 shots into me. Any more? Okay, so he puts 4 shots into me, shaving off 440 hit points, and oh dear, that's a KV-220. This is a bad situation, and there's a Marder from the other side who's trying to shoot me in the side. So you'll have noticed at the beginning of this game, by the way, that most of our team went over to the southeast corner. I came over to the glacier, or this middle section, still because I figured someone needed to keep an eye on this area. And I didn't really want to go to that southeast corner, but anyway, maybe I'll come to regret that. We shall see. So that's a rather optimistic looks. Never mind. We're up to, well, now 639 damage done. 280 blocked by our armour and 462 assistance just as we pick up a kill on that Marder 38T, and there you can see the amazing shell velocity again. This is the stock gun from the M4 Sherman, so if you've played the Sherman, you know what you're getting. Now, our team is actually doing quite well, but I got myself into trouble there, losing a lot of health to the T1 Heavy. And I decide, okay, screw it. I've managed to get up here, out of the way, people aren't shooting me in the side anymore, I'm down to a shade over a third of my hit points. I'm not going to be a front line anymore if I can avoid it. What can I do instead? Well, I do have 10 degrees of gun depression. And that T1 Heavy has decided to push round through from the heavy area. And I'm just wondering if I can do something about this. Now, the rear armour of the T1 Heavy is atrocious, so good old-fashioned regular AP will do the job here. In fact, in a moment, I believe I'm actually going to try a HE round. I'm going to mess it up, though. So HE round, I aim at the rear of his tank. I should really have aimed at the engine deck instead of his backside, but what you going to do? I switch back to AP, and this guy is just in a terrible position now. And this is why when people say, you know, oh no, gold ammo and all the other things in this game, position and awareness are so much more important. Anyway, having feasted on that T1 Heavy, that's actually got our damage count over 1100. And despite the fact that you might initially have looked at the deployment of our team and gone, oh god, it's a lemming train, and despite the fact that I didn't have a particularly great start, our team's done alright, and we've actually managed to pull this one through. Matilda here, I'm switching to APCR because whilst you can penetrate a Matilda with the regular AP ammo on this thing, you really have to be able to aim for weak spots, and I just don't really have the hit points for it. I wasn't expecting to just have nice flat shots into his side, but as it is, I do. Can we pick up the kill? No. Can we pick up the kill? No. God damn it. Scoreline's 11-6. And, ooh, Stug. Be really nice to pick up the kill on this Stug. And we do. And there's a KV-220. We're not going to do anything to him with our armour piercing. Oh, we took a track off. So, we're now going to swing round, and instead of going after that KV-220, I'm going to load a high explosive round and see if we can do something about that M37 artillery piece, and then see if we can do something about that DSPZ-ins, I don't know how to pronounce it. Now the enemy team have clawed this back a little bit, but we're capping, and unless that KV-220 is going to pull a blinder, which he might, this should be ours. There we go. Nice penetrating HE round into the artillery to one-shot him for 154. And we're up to 1620 damage. And we're just looking for this medium tank, but with only 10 seconds left on the game, there's a very good chance we're not going to find him, and as it turns out, he's got away scot-free. Our team caps. They actually kill the KV-220 as well, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So that's the first game, and we got ourselves into a little bit of trouble there, as I was saying, but we managed to dig ourselves out a bit and decide, you know, this is a bad engagement, let's go somewhere else. And you can see there, same tier heavies can happily penetrate you from range with regular AP ammo, and the T1 Heavy has relatively low penetration on its gun. I believe it's 128 on that 76mm gun. Anyway, let's have a look at the post-game stats for this one. So that actually ended up being enough for second class mastery, 5 for effect, bruiser, fighter, and a high caliber medal. That wasn't too shabby in the end. 1,620 damage done, 5 kills, or 1,187 base experience. Now I was a little bit surprised that 1,187 base XP in this thing was only enough for second class mastery. Back in the day, less than 1,000 base XP got you the ace in this tank, but things have changed, so it is what it is. I'm not complaining, just commenting. And we easily did the best on our team. The next highest scoring individual was the Panzer IV-H, and he did about half my damage. Shoutouts to the enemy KV-220 and the DSPZ-ins. Still don't know how to pronounce that thing. They did a respectable amount of damage and got 8 kills between them. Just a shame the rest of their team weren't really up to it. 22 shots fired, 20 hits, 16 penetrations for that damage count, most of which was from relatively close range. 10 hits received, 5 penned, 5 did not, for 280 damage blocked by our armour. 8 enemy vehicles damaged, 5 destroyed, 468 assistance damage, and we fired a little bit of APCR, but not too much. So we fired APCR against the Matilda, and I think we fired a shot or two against the KV-220. With a standard account, we still made a respectable profit. So that is the first game. Second game, and like I said, this one is going to be a little bit more controlled, I suppose is the best word for it. Second game then, once again, this is a tier 5 match. Once again, we have 6 tier 5s on each team and 9 tier 4s. Slightly odd setup, but hey ho, go figure I suppose. And we're here on Pearl River this time. Now, because I took a break from this game, I was not very familiar with the Pearl River map at the time of playing this one. I'd had a couple of games on it. Not enormously successful games, I will be honest, but I did have one match in... can't remember what tank, it may even have been this one, can't quite recall, where I'd done okay by fighting it out over the sort of rice paddies in the bottom left corner. So that's what I'm going to try and have a go at in this game. Essentially, I don't really want to take on the KV-222 or the T1 Heavy. When I was playing this, by the way, loads of people seem to be out in the KV-220. I don't remember that thing being so common. It's frustrating. But anyway. So this is in a bid to avoid those tanks, to minimise the amount of APCR I need to fire, and just farm all the little tanks with my AP. Similar sort of thing I would do with the IS-6, penetration sucks. So I'm trying to put myself into a position where I'm not really going to meet the most heavily armoured tanks on the enemy team. That's the plan. Also, this is an encounter game, so the capture circle is over here anyway. So there's much less value going around the other side of the map. Anywho, these are the rice paddies. Are these rice paddies? I don't know. Or are these just bodies of water? Whatever. This is the region of the map that I wanted to try out. Because like I say, I'd had an okay game over here. So I wanted to have a go in a top tier tank, essentially, and see how much you can bully people over here. And as this is an encounter game and it overlooks the capture circle, even better. I'm loading a high explosive round to deal with this Panzer 4C. That will make him quite sad, and there you go. 175. Bang on average damage roll. I try a similar thing against the Panzer 1C, but no, that thing seems to have enough armour to generally shrug off HE, so worth knowing. Either way, we've already racked up 615 assistance damage just by spotting those plebs, by the way, so that's always entertaining. Now, trying to spot people out over here, I've switched back to armour piercing, Panzer 3J. He has a kind of dubious gun, not saying he couldn't penetrate me, but he might find it quite difficult. I believe that's the 5cm gun with about 70 pen on its regular AP ammo. He could of course be using the 75mm gun as well, but it doesn't seem to be a particularly popular choice. Going for a shot on the M8A1, we actually bounce on that lightly armoured tank destroyer. Can we do something about this PZSFL? Yes, we can. And, ooh, that's the rear of the Panzer III. And we're just going to keep shooting this guy, and something slightly unusual happens in a moment. Despite the fact that he is there, and he is definitely within my view range and everything, I can't see him anymore. Now I can only speculate on the reasons for this. I'm just going to keep blazing away at this location for a while, because it looks like these shots are generally hitting. My speculation would be that I can hit a bit of his hull, but maybe because the game draws line of sight from a couple of specific points on the tank when it works out whether you can spot someone or not, or whether you can see someone or not, maybe those particular bits of the tank can't see his hull. Either way, my blind shots clearly were hitting as we managed to whittle him down to 58 health, but we missed the killing shot. Ohs and noes. Side shot on the T1 Heavy actually bounces, probably hit his turret or something, or hit something at a rather dubious angle. So, scoreline's 5-2, our team's doing alright, and we're having a good go at it. Add on, ooh, marder, no. So onto our 401 damage, you can probably add about another 300 blind or something like that. So we're probably on around 700 damage done, and around, well, 630 now assistance. So, can we pull more shots off on people? M8A1 again, but he doesn't really seem to want to have anything to do with us. Can't really say I blame him. Good luck against an AMX-40, but I'm able to shoot the M8, so it's not all bad. These guys appear to have come to the conclusion that they're kind of outfought, so they're backing off, but Panzer 3J, remember him from earlier on, he's having a bad game, and he becomes our second kill. So, we're not under any sort of pressure here, really. We're much more dictating the pace of the engagement and just bullying these guys a little bit. So M8A1 decides he wants to come out and have some. T1 Heavy, yeah, we managed to put that shot into his side. Can we do it again? No. He bounces on us, and we're going to discover shortly that that T1 Heavy is actually stock. Well, he's certainly using the stock turret. Goodbye M8A1. And we're going to use that to our advantage in a moment. But being stock means, among other things, looks like that AMX-40 stock as well, that his stock turret doesn't have quite the armour of the fully upgraded turret, I don't believe. It also indicates he might be using a weaker gun. Often you need the upgraded turret before you can mount the top gun on tanks. Not always, but often. So we're going to push up, we're going to load APCR, and we're going to take advantage of the fact that he's using the stock turret. Now, I don't actually notice that here, because I'm not familiar with the hit points of Tier 5 heavy tanks anymore since the changes, since they buffed the hit points of all the sort of low tier tanks. So I'm going to take advantage of his stock turret by, hello my AMX-40, putting shots straight through the front of it. This is APCR, again, 120 something penetration, 127. So I could do this with a regular Tier 5 heavy tank and probably more effectively. Trying it on the AMX-40, no dice. And this probably wouldn't work so well. Ooh, AMX-40 with a death wish. This probably wouldn't work so well if he was using the fully upgraded turret. And if he was using the fully upgraded turret, honestly, I probably wouldn't even be trying. I'd be trying to be a bit more aggressive, get around his side or something like that. But he's using the stock turret, so meh. We'll just punish him. And spoiler alert, I'm never going to get to that M10 before he dies. Like, speed this along and you'll see what I mean. So that was just a much more a game at which we were able to dictate the pace much more easily, and we weren't really being put under the same sort of pressure as the previous match, and we even managed to bounce a few shots into the bargain. So let's have a look at the post-game stats for this one. Okay, so that ended up being enough for First Class Mastery, Fire for Effect, Fighter, and another High Caliber medal, which was pretty nice. And you can see there that we did actually manage to put a reasonable amount of damage into that Panzer 3J. 5 shots, by the look of it, including the killing shot. 1,808 damage done, 4 kills, or 1,294 base experience. Still not enough to ace this thing. I have subsequently aced this tank. I don't know what the exact ace requirements are, but I had to get over 1,500 base experience to ace this thing. Now, I'd aced it before, but these days. So people seem to be doing quite well in the T14. Anyway, shout-outs to the enemy M10, commiserations to him. 1,701 damage and 5 kills. Not enough for the win there. His team just didn't pull through. Then again, given his location, you could argue he wasn't in the right place on the map. Imagine if he'd done that damage over where I was, where it kind of counted. But it is what it is. 36 shots fired, 27 hits, 18 pens for that damage count. 4 damage from a distance of more than 300 metres. 4. 8 hits received, 1 penetrated, 6 did not, for 510 damage blocked by our armour. We bounced a few rounds from that T1 heavy there. Assuming he was using the stock gun, because he definitely had the stock turret, he's still packing around 100 penetration, so it's not as if his penetration is insignificant. 5 enemy vehicles spotted, 5 damaged, 4 destroyed, 627 assistance damage, and even though, again, we fired a little bit of APCR, we still made a respectable profit in that one, bearing in mind because both these games were played over the festive period. As you can see from the festive atmosphere nonsense in the background, that did give us a few more credits, but still a profit and a nice amount of experience. So, there we go, that's the gameplay. Let's just go and round things off in the garage a little bit. So, what are my thoughts on this tank then? Well, it's very difficult to put your finger on anything about this thing that's particularly good. And yet, despite that, I've been doing well in it. So if we have a quick look at my stats, for example, I've played 103 games in this thing, I've got a 63% win rate, I do an average of 916 damage per game, at tier 5, plus another 237 assistance, and if you're interested in such things, I have an average WN8 on this thing of about 2,500. The 50 games I played for this review, that was about 3,000, which dragged the average up from 2,000 to 2.5. I do well in it, but I struggle to put my finger on exactly why. It doesn't have amazing armour. The armour's okay, but it's not amazing. The gun is pretty rubbish, if we're going to be honest. The mobility's not that great, so why would I do well in it? I mean, I've had a respectable crew in it, I suppose, but I don't know. It does get a nice slug of hit points at 900, but I think a lot of it comes down to that factor that people so often gloss over or ignore because it's difficult to factor into things, or just tell you it doesn't make any difference, which is nonsense because it does. This thing gets preferential matchmaking, so you never see tier 7s. You're kind of a tier 4.5 tank. And I wonder if that just has a big enough impact to make this thing do alright. Having said that, there is an issue with this tank. So, if you own this thing and you haven't taken it out in a while, I would recommend you go and give it a spin. But, this thing is not for regular sale in the premium shop. So if you like the performance, or like the look of the performance of this thing, and you want it, that poses you with a problem. Do I have a suggestion to the problem? Well, I kind of do. So, this thing is never going to make you a lot of money because of its reliance on APCR ammo. This thing is not a particularly good crew trainer because of the weird crew layout compared to other American heavy tanks, which is a bit awkward. And it's not available in the premium shop, but if you are interested in something like this, the Excelsior is. Now, the Excelsior is a very, very similar machine. It's the British equivalent of this. Still gets limited matchmaking, has essentially the same gun, or a very similar gun. And that is available for sale in the premium shop for about 6 quid. 6 quid something, it's not exactly expensive. So you could pick that up if you wanted to, and have probably a fairly similar gaming experience. I will do a review of the Excelsior at some point, and the Excelsior is certainly the far more common tank to come across. T14s, they're not uncommon. Well, it's not that you don't see them, but you rarely see more than about 1 or 2 per match, whereas I had a game the other day with about 4 or 5 Excelsiors per team. So, yeah, there's that. And that's kind of where we are with the T14. I do well, but I can't put my finger on why I do well in it. I want to say this is quite an underwhelming tank, because on paper it is. But again, in practice, I've been doing well in it. So maybe it's not, and I think the preferential matchmaking plays a big part. I'm going round and round in circles again, because I honestly don't know whether to recommend this thing or not. If you've got it, try it out. If you haven't, you can't, maybe try out a friend's, or possibly think about the Excelsior. That's the conclusion that I come to, I suppose, with this thing. So there it is. I hope you guys enjoyed that review, possibly even found it vaguely informative. If you did, by all means feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel. You can also go and jump on Discord, You can support me on Patreon, there are links in the description, and I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao ciao.